There was always a peculiar hush before the annual Memorial Benevolence Committee's spring rehearsal, but this year that sacred pause detonated into uproar. Mrs. Evadne Slipper-Guardian, possessor of a vision unclouded by sentiment, had gone pale at the sight confronting her in the nave, where the late Reverend Tunk's modest urn ought to have rested, arranged tastefully with primroses now sprawled, if such a word can be applied to the recently deceased, a floridly mismatched coffin. Worse still, from the half-lowered lid emerged a vibrant spray of artificial blue gladioli, incongruously cheerful against polished walnut. She yanked the curtain aside with such force that the rings flew and clattered, and one particularly distressed hook impaled itself into Mr. Clough's hat, which had been innocently resting on the front pew. The entire rehearsal flock, assembled for quiet homage, and not for sudden displays of theatrical flair, collectively gasped and then quickly began to talk over one another. Gossip rippled, irrepressible. I saw two men in brown overalls by the vestry last night. I said, "That's not right for Lent, is it?" Well, if you ask me, Mrs. Slipper always did have trouble with her curtains. My cousin swears that's old Mrs. Goodbody's casket. She's not even dead. No, it's a council cut back. They're sharing coffins now, like books from the library. Do you think the flowers mean something? Blue's unlucky for Methodists. Oblivious to the swirl, Sergeant Love busied himself trying to retrieve Mr. Clough's hat, now bearing both the curtain ring and a faint whiff of paraffin. Meanwhile, Inspector Purbright, a few paces behind but temperamentally half a mile distant, surveyed the scene. He knelt without ceremony, picking at something on the aisle runner, a clipped price tag, barely visible, dusted with a glimmer of silver thread. He rose, letting the tag drop from his fingers as he regarded the impromptu assembly of mourners, machinists, and amateur florists. Curious, Purbright remarked quietly, eyes absently calculating how the costliest blooms appear only after the shops have closed. His voice, so measured and bland, might have been cataloguing tea bags. Mrs. Slipper, resentful perhaps that anyone not directly responsible was so calmly engaged, clutched at her clipboard like a crusader's shield. "Inspector, I do not wish to alarm, but that arrangement she gestured at, the craven bouquet, is positively indecent, not to say inauthentic." "Not indecent, Mrs. Slipper," Purbright murmured, "just rather unexpected." It was then that Miss Clotilde Vyse, chief organist and indefatigable supplier of scalding rumour, stifled a scream. She pointed, hand trembling, to the vestry door. A folded scrap of paper protruded from beneath, dappled with a faint blue stain. Love was first to reach it, picking the note up with a tongs-bearing slow motion usually reserved for rare species or molasses pudding. It read, in a shaky, anonymous script, "The truth lies not in ceremony but in what is owed. Ask who is missing and why." A hush heavier than before settled. The coffin, the curtains, and the baffled assembly all paused, as if waiting for the vicar himself, risen, to supply an answer. But Purbright only smiled, the corners of his mouth imperceptibly curling, as outside the first spring rain began, soft and insistent, likely to set tongues wagging for the rest of the week. The clock struck the hour, but no one moved. Something had begun in Flaxborough, and no one, nor the committee, not the living or the dead, would leave unchanged. The rain, steady and gentle, seemed to press Flaxborough down a little closer to earth after the evening's unwonted excitement, keeping the townsfolk tucked inside their parlours, where thoughts could grow fat on speculation. Yet even as the clock in St. Leonard's Tower dripped minutes into the damp night, no one felt safely shut from scandal. Early the next morning, the news had already outrun the truth, swirling frantically through the arteries of the market town. The public benches ordinarily host to the weathered silence of pigeons were given over to clusters of matrons and errant schoolboys. Both seemed convinced that the coffin rehearsal had uncovered a plot too sizable and sinister for the likes of Mrs. Slipper's clipboard. This belief, embellishing as it passed, grew at the bakery queue. "It's witches! Why else did those blue flowers blossom over fish and chips? I tell you, it's that new council debenture, and it matured in the snug of the Crow and Trumpet. If old Goodbody's casket can turn up there, what's stopping mine?" From the police station, Sergeant Love, dutiful, if perpetually a step behind rumour, passed Purbright the note retrieved at last night's shambles. Purbright turned it over twice, sniffed, then let it rest beside his teacup, as if watching for it to grow legs. "Do you suppose," Love offered, "it's a warning, sir, or Orwellian advice?" Purbright eyed him with an expression so neutral it circled the drain of indifference. "It's possible the writer meant to point us in a direction, Sergeant. The challenge, as always, is whether they wish us to arrive or wander in circles." Love frowned, plodding between leads. "Should we start with those missing, or see who owed what, sir?" "Let us do both, Love. Begin with Mrs. Slipper and the rehearsal committee, but gently." The Memorial Benevolence Committee proved not gentle. Its meeting relocated to the back room of Slipper's drapery, easier for refreshments, was already in swing, if swing can be applied to a group composed entirely of iron will and drop-scone stamina. Mrs. Slipper presided, behind flinty spectacles. Miss V's supplied both biscuits and a running tally of possible sins committed lately in the vestry. Purbright entered with no more ceremony than a nod. "Ladies, I believe you can assist with an unorthodox occurrence. Would you have noticed anything unusual ahead of last evening?" Mrs. Slipper drew herself up as one who suspects blame disguised as politeness. "Nothing so very unusual, Inspector. The only intrusion was from the town council changing locks and moving the flower vases as they do." Miss Vyse snorted. "The new boy at Blossom and Vine brought the wrong flowers twice. First the pink, then the blue gladioli. Said it was what had been ordered." "At whose instruction?" Purbright's tone betrayed neither challenge nor encouragement, but the room seemed to constrict a little. Miss Vyse hesitated, the chinks in her armour obvious. "Mrs. Mayhew?" "She's in charge of the floral rotation, but she's not herself lately." Mrs. Slipper fluttered her papers. "Well, no one can say she hasn't been distracted since the church appeal went sour. Distracted, sour, unspecific, yet a name to add to the list." Purbright took note, eyes scanning the corners of the room, pausing ever so slightly on a folded length of silver thread dropped beneath a chair. Love, sensing the gaze, retrieved it and pocketed the evidence without fuss. As the interviews wore on, it became apparent that among the committee's ranks, rivalries flowered far more audaciously than gladioli. Mrs. Slippers, suspicious of anyone with an untidy filing system, hinted at irregularities in Miss V's hymn selection last quarter. Miss V's, in turn, regarded Mrs. Mayhew's charitable accounts as loose at both ends. Each had some small anxiety about sliding forward into the conversation, hoping it might share the load or steer suspicion away. The next stop was Blossom and Vine, where Purbright and Love found William, the nervous apprentice. William, pale and blue-fingered, confessed to the gladioli mistake, but added, "They told me it was for a special ceremony, but no one ever said whose." He stumbled over the name Mayhew, finally giving way. "She said not to mark the invoice yet, said she'd pay directly." "Have you ever delivered to the church before?" Purbright's question tripped lightly, but William's answer was loaded with local geometry. "No, usually I take the arrangements to the council offices, but this time it was just the church at dusk." As they left, Love whispered, "Could you arrest someone for giving the wrong flowers, sir?" "Only in townships with stricter laws than ours," Purbright replied. but it points to something less floral and more financial, I think. Back in the quiet of their office, the pieces did not so much fit as jostle. Mrs. Mayhew had both motive in distraction and opportunity in finance. Mrs. Slipper had access, possibly more than was strictly necessary, and Miss V's wielded influence over ceremonies public and private. The apprentice was nervous, possibly innocent, yet clearly following odd instructions. A knock interrupted them. Mr. Clough, hat unharmed but dignity slightly dented, entered with purpose. "I thought you ought to know, Inspector, my mother's receipt for a memorial subscription has gone missing. It's the only proper copy without it. That whole plot," he gestured vaguely towards St. Leonard's, as if the stones might eavesdrop could belong to anyone. Purbright listened, never commenting, and only asked, "And the receipt was kept where?" "In her deed box, of course, locked, but she says the lock had been tampered with, scratched as if someone tried a dozen times." Thanking Clough, Purbright let silence digest the confession. When the door closed, Love exhaled. "So someone's after plot ownership. Could that be it, sir?" "Possibly, Sergeant. Or perhaps something owed, as our note suggested. It's peculiar for a memorial rehearsal to produce a scandal unless someone stands to gain." As midday approached, the second round of gossip infected the town anew. The butcher's daughter was overheard proposing the vicar had run up debts at the bingo. Mrs. Felbridge, who had seen the coffin herself, swore emotionally at the greengrocer that the council is hiding some blue flowers for a blue ledger. Meanwhile, a group of sixth formers, barely post-puberty, theorized that the rehearsal was a dry run for mass exhumation, a phrase certain to horrify local sensibilities and delight headline writers. Each line, each pause, seemed to lead deeper, never conclusive, always suggestive. By late afternoon, Purbright sat in the quiet of St. Leonard's, tracing the path from nave to vestry door. He pictured the blue-stained note, the clipped price tag, and the stray silver threadball artifacts that nested discomfort in the usual routines. Love gazed at a hymn board, as if musical numerology might lend support. "Do you think, sir, they emptied the box, or just wanted her lock?" Purbright said nothing, but touched the mark where the coffin had left a faint scuff on the linoleum aisle, then glanced up as someone quickly, unseen, dashed through the porch, dropping what looked, in dusk light, like a committee badge. Suspense, it seemed, was still growing roots. Purbright pocketed the badge, his face as unreadable as before, while Love looked after the fleeing figure, mouth half open. The inspector's next move, he knew, would be as quiet as rain on stone, but the town and the truth seemed anything but silent. If anything possessed a longer memory than Flaxborough's people, it was Flaxborough's routines. Next morning, as the sun attempted half-heartedly to burn away the drizzle, familiar shapes traced familiar paths. The butcher's knife scraped at the block, doors above the greengrocer's rattled open, and along Market Lane, council workers whistled a hymn that would have been uplifting if not for the funereal tempo. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love made their way to the church again, not hurrying, neither feeling the need to chase chaos. The badge found near the porch of Enid Felbridge, its council initials unmistakable, provided an opening polite enough. They found her in the churchyard, prodding an uncooperative rosebush with gloved hands and muttering prayers for its character. Mrs. Felbridge received them with fixed courtesy, concern worn as one might a hat, only taken off in company not to be trusted. "I must apologize, Inspector, for leaving in such haste yesterday. Well, I felt a little faint, too much excitement, and pollen." Sergeant Love, ever literal, scanned the air as if seeking signs of allergen assault. Purbright offered the recovered badge, saying nothing. She stared at it briefly, then tucked it away, a tremor in her hand the only concession to embarrassment. "I do hope it wasn't a disturbance. I did not wish to intrude after the rehearsal, you understand." "We quite understand, Mrs. Felbridge," Purbright replied, gaze mild. "Did you notice anyone when you left?" "Oh, Noel, yes. There was a figure, I thought, over by the vestry. It might have been Mrs. Mayhew, or just a trick of light. I wasn't stopping to make introductions. There are some odd breezes in that corner at night." She bent to her rosebush again, more vigorously now. Across the way, Councilman Peacekeeper of Funds and part-time town crier, depending on the financial weather, strode up with practised indignation. "Inspector, I trust you're sorting all this before Monday's meeting. The last thing we want is panic over plots, funerary or parliamentary." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Between ourselves, Mayhew's numbers have never quite recovered since the appeal collapse. She's been worried about the audit. But if this is mischief," and here his look landed uneasily on Mrs. Felbridge, whose brow furrowed at the implication. "Nothing so dramatic, Mr. Pierce," Purbright said, though the town ledger speaks as loud as any sermon. Pierce bristled, confused with a dash of fear, before retreating behind a bluster. "It all needs sorting. Clean books, clean conscience. Tell her I said so." Love, who had been inspecting the porch for further dropped items, called over in a stage whisper, "Sir, there's a patch here. The paint's scuffed. Recently. Like. And there's wax. Blue wax." Even Mrs. Felbridge straightened at that, eyes flicking from the porch to Purbright. "Blue, well, that would match the candle display for the appeal, but surely they weren't lit. The last thing we need is to set the place ablaze on top of everything else." Purbright stooped, surveying for more clues, but rose empty-handed, saving curiosity. "Blue wax, blue gladioli, blue ledger. Someone's repeating themselves, Sergeant." Inside St. Leonard's, the scent of polish fought an uphill battle against stone, old books and ecclesiastical faintness. At the altar, Mrs. Mayhew herself prepared hymn sheets for Sunday, her fingers trembling, lips moving in silent rehearsal, as if the correct numbers might magic away all other misfortunes. When approached, she folded the music resolutely. "You've come about the flowers, no doubt. I know it looks singular, Inspector, but everything was delivered as it should be. I just wasn't expecting Mr. Tunk's coffin, that's all." "No one was. Did you authorize the blue gladioli?" Purbright asked. His tone, while harmless, gave Mrs. Mayhew visible pause. "I asked for spring flowers. I didn't choose colours. When they arrived, Mr. Felbridge said blue was fitting, given the fundraiser. It's all for the tower, you see. The money we have still isn't enough." Reverend Tunk wanted blue banners strung from the belfry. It seemed a harmless tribute. Love scribbled energetically as Mrs. Mayhew's words zigzagged between explanation and evasion. And in the rehearsal, who secured the nerve for it? "I did," she admitted. "There are forms, but Mrs. Slipper keeps them. She insists on cross-checking everything since the accounts were double-entered last winter." Her cheeks coloured noticeably. "Double-entered?" Purbright's brow flicked upward, but no further. "It was an error," Mrs. Mayhew managed, but it unsettled the committee. "They've not let me forget it." Her hand fluttered towards her service badge, absent-mindedly brushing over her cardigan. The movement halted, confusion flitting across her face. No badge. In that instant, the peal of St. Leonard's chimes broke in a discordant note that had no place amongst the quarter hour's otherwise tedious predictability. Each tone landed with a jarring clang, as if an amateur hand had seized the ropes. In the churchyard, heads turned. A group of children, loitering about, cheered at the noise, a rare entertainment occasioned by error. A flurry met the entrance to the belfry. Purbright, Love and Mrs. Mayhew hurried through the nave, up the narrow stair. Within the chamber, the light seemed frantic, cutting over dust motes and half-melted candles, several knocked sideways. The town's sexton, Mr. Hoppet, appeared ruffled and unsuitably breathless, his hand caught on the bell cord. Saw a cat, Inspector. I chased it off. A wretched creature knocked my candle flame over. Look at the mess. He waved toward a toppled clipboard and a small battered cash box wide open. Inside, Purbright's eyes lingered on the cash box's contents. A single scrap of blue ribbon, 1 silver-pound coin, and a council memo re-missing receipts. Query all event proceeds. Urgent. Love cleared his throat, poker-faced. Doesn't seem like much for a fundraiser, Mr. Hoppet. I was told the donations were being banked regularly, the sexton protested. Only a token is kept here, some sort of new protocol. Purbright pointed to the memo. Who else has keys to the belfry? Only me and Mrs. Mayhew, as far as I know, unless Mrs. Slipper's still using the old spare. She likes to keep for accidents and won't trust one lock where two will do. The chimes began again, unexpectedly. The rope, flung by the earlier scuffle, swayed as though protesting its involvement. In the chaos, Love retrieved a scrap of paper tucked behind the ledger. Receipt withheld per instruction. Blue code only. It looked very much like Mrs. Mayhew's writing, though her composure was now glass-thin. Descending, Mrs. Mayhew lingered behind the party, gazing back at the silent bells, colour waning. Purbright waited at the bottom, regarding her kindly. Security in numbers, Mrs. Mayhew, or so I'm told. She hesitated, as if weighing a burden. I never meant anything to go missing, Inspector. I only did what I was told. The blue code was all supposed to be for the fundraising tally, council's orders, but nothing ever quite balances, does it? Not in Flaxborough, Mrs. Mayhew, Purbright replied. His tone, lighter than air, seemed somehow to carry weight enough to press her confession into place. Outside, as the townsfolk gathered to comment on the bell's misadventures, highlighting the rivalry of last year's lost hymn sheet, rumours flowered. Did you see the inspector's face? I'd say he suspects poison next. Can't trust those with the keys to coffins, that's what I always say. Purbright and Love, making their way to the parish office, fell silent, each absorbed by what the chimes had disturbed. Not just routine, surely, but something brittle underneath an economy of secrets, thriving only so long as no one tugged on the wrong thread. The air promised rain. In Flaxborough, it always did, but the town now waited like a congregation before a particularly strained hymn for the next discord to toll. For all the gravity that scandal lent to the church and its residents, Flaxborough's week rolled faithfully toward its customary highlight, the spring flower show, held on the market square beneath a tent that might, in a more self-assured town, have been called a marquee. The flower show was not simply an occasion for horticultural display, but an annual parade of rivalry, ambition, and discreet sabotage camouflaged among petunias and gossip. It was, by some unwritten Georgic law, the event at which reputations rooted themselves in compost or bloom. Purbright attended with the kind of polite resolve one might reserve for watching Parliament in session, or a neighbour's wedding, impassive, undistracted, and acutely observant. Sergeant Love trailed slightly behind, already spotted by Mrs. Slipper, who handed him a sheet of Flock's competitors. For your safety, Sergeant. This year's Flocks are unusually political. The committee's seating offered a theatrical vantage. Mrs. Slipper presided on a rickety folding chair just below the judges' table, with Mrs. Mayhew, now composed but tightly so, keeping tally on a stack of forms. Miss V's had assumed her annual post as announcement reader, her voice ringing with the certainty reserved for those who know the outcome in advance. Councilman Pierce drifted between stalls, feigning curiosity about route structure while listening in on conversations for hints of trouble. Purbright, quietly surveying the crowd, noted the well-trodden footpath near the blue gladioli display, a route all judges took at least twice. As he passed, a sharp voice rose over the general hum. "I beg your pardon, my Flock's entry has vanished." The crowd rippled in sympathetic surprise, turning to see Mrs. Felbridge, hands raised and trembling, standing by an empty plot. Miss V's confirmed the absence, raising her spectacles as though the act might restore the lost blooms. "Well, it was there at 10. The sheets don't lie." Murmurs swirled, some whispering of theft, others of sabotage, and a few that Mrs. Felbridge's entry, never the most inspiring, had simply wilted from exposure to council politics. The judging proceeded awkwardly, with contestants glancing over their shoulders. When the time for the prize arrived, the committee, trusting to order, awarded the silver spade to William from Blossom and Vine, whose blue gladioli, vibrant and artificial, sat plump and guiltless at the front. The crowd erupted, not so much applauding as querying the choice with a chorus of, "What those? They're not even real." Mrs. Felbridge's face puckered, part insult, part anxiety, as Miss Vyse, flustered, hurried to announce, "It's just a demonstration of novelty in local horticulture, everyone." The appeal required something modern. That only stoked the grumbling chorus. Amid the confusion, Purbright knelt by the vanished phlox plot. He fingered the edge of the wooden display board and found a faint smear of blue was the same shade as that found earlier on the church porch. He glanced at Sergeant Love, who had broken away from the crowd, keenly watching Mrs. Mayhew as she conferred in whispers with Councilman Pierce and Mrs. Slipper behind a curtain of roses. Love sidled closer. "Sir, she seems nervous. They're arguing. Pierce wants the tally now, but Mayhew says some sheets are missing." Purbright straightened, less concerned with who'd won phlox supremacy than with who had moved about so unobserved. He caught Clough, hat restored, now setting out sandwiches at the tea-stand, and called him over in a tone never quite urgent, but always timely. "Clough, have you seen anyone leave the tent rather suddenly? And what of Mrs. Felbridge's phlox? Any sign?" Clough, grateful for the chance to narrate rather than serve, obliged. "I did see Mrs. Mayhew speaking to the boy from Blossom and Vine, rather agitated. Something about numbers not matching, I can't say what. As for the phlox, I saw young Ada Forbus with a bunch just like them slipped into her shopping bag, but she's not a competitor. Her mother's a council clerk, though." The committee, distracted by public outrage at the artificial gladioli victory, began to quarrel in voices growing sharp enough for even the flowers to wilt. Miss V's scrambled for order. "The Novelty Award does not replace the silver spade. My apologies." But Mrs. Felbridge, slighted and distressed, declared, "If the council can't keep track of real blooms, what can they possibly do for memorial funds?" Suspicion, newly seeded, grew swiftly in the shade cast by blue wax and blue blooms. Purbright leaned in, speaking softly. "Curious that the wrong flowers can win the right prize, Sergeant, but the right flowers can vanish without a trace." As the tent buzzed with controversy, Love caught Ada Forbus at the exit, holding a shopping bag that betrayed a hint of green. When questioned, Ada stammered, "I was asked to fetch them for Mrs. Mayhew." She said the judges needed to examine them privately for the fundraiser pictures. "Did she pay you?" Love prompted, with the innocence of one who hopes for truth but expects denial. Ada shrugged. "No, just said to bring them straight away. But then she went off with Mr. Pierce and I never saw them again. Miss Vyse, beset now by 2 competitors and an inquest over novelty awards, declared that the contest was suspended until the missing phlox could be located. Order phlox before roses, please. Always." While the flower show dissolved into disorder, Purbright noted that the blue wax smear continued in a faint line toward the back tables, where the fundraising ledger also sat exposed. Mrs. Mayhew hovered near, nervously retracing tally sheets with Councilman Pierce just behind her, voice flat but insistent. "If those sheets are lost, the council will require an audit. Nobody wants another appeal failure. Mrs. Slipper, meanwhile, attempted to shield the ledger with her clipboard, as if scolding wandering hands. Mrs. Felbridge, now red with outrage, refused to leave until her flocks was returned. At the committee table, Miss V's tried to restore order with promises of a second judging, drawing the attention of a dozen residents hungry for either a prize or a scandal. The tent swirled with gossip, each new theory contradicting the previous. Mrs. Mayhew took the flocks for her window box. No, Ada did, but only for the school show. Council's hiding receipts in the gladioli look, wax everywhere. Inspector Purbright doesn't blink. He's seen worse than missing flowers. At the centre of it, Purbright performed his ritual survey, noting a clipped price tag under the ledger table. It matched the silver-threaded tag found at the rehearsal, unremarked by all except himself. As the tent began to empty, the committee withdrew, tensions rose, explanations thinned, and the scandal now broadened. Purbright watched Mrs. Mayhew part from Pierce, both guarding paperwork as if it bore more weight than flowers ever could. Sergeant Love, journal now bristling with more theories than notes, leaned over. "Another public mishap, sir. Seems every clue is as blue as a council invite. Are we missing something?" Purbright, quietly relentless, let silence stand. Perhaps not missing, Sergeant, but mislaid intentionally or otherwise. As the spring flower show dissolved, it left Flaxborough not with answers, but with a haze of blue flowers, wax, and rumours. The scandal had fed upon itself, making certain that everyone, at least for this week, had something to confess or conceal. Morning in Flaxborough found its pulse again, rhythmic with the hum of kettles and the limp thump of post through letter flaps. Yet even the most habitual acts could not muffle the fallout from the flower show. The mystery of the missing flocks, the dubious blue wax, and Mrs. Mayhew's anxieties were now as firmly rooted in the day's gossip as the price of lamb at Clough's butcher. The entire affair had seeded itself in the stubborn soil of local thinking, sprouting stories behind every closed shop door. Inspector Purbright, whose detachment was famous, he'd watch his own house on fire and wonder who'd paid the rates. The verger muttered he was at his desk, just after dawn, sifting slowly through the ledger that Mrs. Slipper, under much protest, had surrendered. Sergeant Love arrived, bearing the small clipped price tag found beneath the ledger table, and a thermos with a dubious history that might have spanned 3 investigations. Purbright spoke without looking up. "Phlox is still missing, Sergeant?" "Not so much as a petal turned up, sir. Mrs. Felbridge nearly barricaded the market tent overnight, but she slept in her car, so she'd know. Dedication or desperation?" Love hesitated. "Both, I'd say. She's convinced the committee's out to ruin her standing and says she'll take her blooms to North Tilby next year out of protest." Purbright smiled faintly, a drastic measure for a regional phlox. He tapped at the ledger, its columns and notations more cryptic than poetry. "I see here that several floral entries were noted as paid by council voucher B/G/LAD code. That fits with what Mrs. Mayhew said." Love scanned the page. "Blue gladioli code, sir, used for anything tied to the Belfry appeal. Yet the matching receipts are not all here," Purbright observed, "and neither are the notes for 3 entries. Funds for the Belfry seem to have multiplied in the committee's books, then vanished when anyone asks for a count. Would you call that cultivation or graft?" "Could be either, if you ask me," Love replied, a touch too earnestly. Everyone seems a bit fast with the pruning shears round the paperwork. Their next destination was the shaded side lane behind Blossom and Vine, where William, the apprentice florist, swept errant petals with more zeal than necessary, humming a tune that might have been "Abide with Me" or "Money, Money, Money," depending on the wind. "William, what about yesterday Mrs. Mayhew's instructions?" Purbright's tone hovered between gentle inquiry and blunt expectation. William's eyes widened. She said the phlox was needed quickly for a council matter, not the show. I helped Ada, but never knew where they went. You delivered them to her directly? Love prompted. Not quite, Sergeant. Handed to Mr. Pierce at the tent's side. He was in a hurry, too, and said the auditors wanted proof of prize-worthy blooms for funding paperwork. He had blue wax on his cuff, I noticed, when he took the box. Purbright filed this away, as he did everything, with meticulous care. Thank you, William. Keep an eye on your vouchers. Someone's making free with council codes. The morning's pace kept quick whispers that the committee would soon name a culprit for the flower show fiasco. Others said Mrs. Mayhew's resignation was being prepared, her departure long overdue. Mrs. Slipper, never one to let gossip spoil opportunities, buttonholed Purbright outside drapery, clipboard braced like a cudgel. Inspector. In my view, all roads lead to Mrs. Mayhew. If you wish for reliability, you want a Slipper to manage events. These receipts you'll find if you look, that her numbers always turn slippery. Purbright listened without comment, and Mrs. Slipper, mistaking his silence for agreement, lowered her voice. She ruined the Belfry appeal, driven Pierce to distraction, and she's forever late with the Sunday school rosters. She sniffed, nose twitching for offence. At the police station, suspicion bloomed. Mrs. Mayhew was summoned, arriving with a face that had outlasted the night's sleep. She sat primly across from Purbright, hands folded tightly around a pale handkerchief. Love produced the price tags, the blue-coded ledger entries, and the report from William and Ada. Purbright remarked, "These phlox were taken at your request and delivered via Mr. Pierce. You said the judges needed them for fundraising pictures, is that correct?" Mrs. Mayhew nodded, lips pressed so thin they nearly disappeared. "I only did as instructed." Mr. Pierce wanted to satisfy the audit. He said if we didn't provide proof, there'd be no more money, and the committee would well find someone else. And the wax? She flinched, but didn't falter. I sealed the paperwork for him. He didn't want it left around, not with Mrs. Slipper prowling. Love bounced his knee, impatience visible. "But the funds, Mrs. Mayhew? The missing receipts? Town talk says the Belfry's been paid for twice." Tears flickered, then vanished. "All I did was tally what the committee asked. I never took money, Inspector. I never changed the numbers. I did find a set of instructions one morning in blue ink that said to process vouchers as donations, no questions." Purbright regarded her looks, which might have comforted but didn't. "Who's writing?" She hesitated. "It could be Miss V's or Mrs. Slipper. Sometimes I think everyone around me uses blue ink. It was enough for town authorities." That afternoon, Councilman Pierce, emboldened by the mounting evidence or pressured by the pulse of rumour, called an informal meeting at the Crow and Trumpet pub. Half the committee attended, eager for a scapegoat. The publicans served up news along with bitter and meat pies. Pierce, voice brimming with officious regret, announced, "Pending investigation of appeal funds and the spring show, Mrs. Mayhew is suspended as committee secretary. She will vacate duties at once, forms forthwith, etc." The crowd, which had anticipated drama but preferred more theatricals, clapped, some in sympathy, some in relief. Purbright, present but uncommitted, allowed the tide to flow over him. Mrs. Mayhew received her condemnation, with a glassy dignity, departing quietly and without protest. Love, watching her go, muttered, "Easy to blame the distracted." Purbright, unmoved, replied, "When accusations come easy, truth resists and keeps its roots deep. Remember, those who shout loudest rarely dig deepest." As the night pressed in, rumour hardened that Mrs. Mayhew was at fault, the funds were missing, and all would be well once she'd been replaced. But not everyone was satisfied with the ledger's holes, and the blue thread of clues continued to tug at something beneath the surface. With the committee's decision delivered and Mrs. Mayhew quietly erased from her posts, Flaxborough's social machinery began visibly clanking. Announcements of her suspension spread across small circles, carried with the peculiar relish reserved for other people's misfortunes. For one rain-bright evening, the town disguised relief as outrage, feigning concern that felt suspiciously like satisfaction. Yet the business of routine does not pause for scandal. Even as Mrs. Mayhew's name drifted like an autumn leaf across the notice board, the preparations for Sunday's memorial service pressed on. Purbright, aware that public order persisted only on a surface of habit, stayed, if possible, even quieter, observing the way townspeople filled Mrs. Mayhew's vacancy before the ink had dried on her suspension. Miss V's appeared at the church that Saturday, clutching a stack of hymn sheets with the determination of a woman destined for higher office. The hymn numbers were written in a telling detail in blue ink. Sergeant Love emerged from the vestry, clutching a notebook that bristled with queries. You'd think after the fuss they'd move the service. Miss Vise says she's handling everything. Mrs. Slipper reorganized the ushers, and Pierce is retailing collections himself. Purbright, kneeling once again over the patch of scuffed linoleum by the aisle, said nothing. The blue wax had faded, a faint scent of candle grease lingered, uncanny and persistent. He straightened as the door banged and Ada Forbes, cheeks ruddy, rushed in with a crate of hymnals. Miss V's asked me to fetch these. She's terrified of being late. Says punctuality's everything now. Love nodded, jotting a note as Ada bustled out. Don't suppose punctuality will balance the accounts, he muttered, but Purbright's gaze was far away, locked somewhere between the battered edges of hymnals and the scratch mark still visible on the vestry door's lock. Outside, the market lane echoed with Friday bustle, but inside St. Leonard's, attention dwelled deeper than candle smoke. The committee, under Pierce's instruction, staged an impromptu audit in the parlour. Mrs. Slipper presided as temporary secretary, brow-knitted. The fundraising ledger passed impatiently between them, now sported fresh notations. Side columns bore hasty corrections, initials in both familiar and stranger hands. Those not present eyed the room through, the church's wavy glass, hoping for scandalous silhouettes. During the audit, Clough shuffled in, clutching an envelope and wearing a face full of unease. Inspector, this just came through the butcher's post. Addressed, urgent for service use, and no sender. Purbright took it as a single slip of paper, again in blue script. Sunday's appeal and Sunday's lie, the true sum rests beneath the bells. Look for the silvered key. He handed it to Love, who frowned. That's the third anonymous note. Sir, all blues and keys. And yet everyone here acts as though the business is over now that Mrs. Mayhew's gone. Purbright drifted to the bell tower, taking note of every door, latch, and seldom-used alcove. He paused at the staircase, glancing at the worn steps, the chipped paint, and, there at the landing, a sliver of silver thread snagged around a protruding nail. At that exact moment, a distant argument broke out in the nave, voices echoing off the stone. You can't just reassign the Belfry appeal to new names, Mrs. Slipper. Some of us worked for those funds. Miss Vise, steely, and Pierce, defensive. Their quarrel, electric, circled the main issue with all the caution of cats poised around cream. Sergeant Love intercepted Ada by the door, lowering his voice. Ada, you delivered phlox for Mrs. Mayhew. Why not for Mrs. Slipper or Miss Vise? Ada hesitated, glancing at the committee, now half-lit by stained glass. They don't ask nicely, Sergeant, and nobody trusts anyone, not since the forms went missing. Mrs. Mayhew always gave me sweets. Purbright climbed the tower. The bell chamber was dusty and unlit, still marked by the clumsy candle disaster from days before. He ran his hand beneath the largest bell, brushing against metal, and at last a cold object, a brass key recently polished and looped with a final thread of silver. He pocketed it, turning as he heard the tail end of Miss Vyse's voice rising in the nave. "No more blue ink, no more secrets. Either the committee restores the receipts, or I walk." Her words, sharper than any she'd ever used in choir, set off a low buzz among those gathered. For a moment, the order of church life stumbled. Pierce blustered, Mrs. Slipper corrected, but Vyse, resurrecting a courage not seen in her since the council picnic scandal, declared, "You want every penny shown?" Then searched the records under the old vicar's initials. That's where numbers grew legs and walked away. Love, returning from the nave, shook his head. Miss Vyse thinks there are 2 ledgers, one public, one private. Both balanced, neither true. By late afternoon, as the committee's audit collapsed into acrimony and the choir rehearsed under Vyse's militant baton, rumours frothed. The belfry money's been used to pay someone's debts. Old Tunk left an IOU under the bell marked in blue wax. It was Mrs. Slipper who kept the lock codes to herself. Pierce collects the appeal but spends from his lunch fund. The church service, meant to heal, now served as the latest arena. Mrs. Felbridge distributed programmes as if passing legal summons. Mr. Hoppet, muttering about receipts and city folk, tuned the bells a semitone higher, making the air itself vibrate. And as the sun slipped, the air grew brittle with expectation. That evening, Purbright met Miss Vyse in the vestry. He offered the silvered key, which she accepted with unsteady hands. Why would anyone hide something under the bell, Inspector? Did they mean for it to be found only now? Purbright replied quietly. Sometimes a key's just for a door no one's tried in years. Sometimes it's for secrets everyone guards badly. Vyse met his gaze, years of restrained honesty trembling. "I was tired of writing blue notes, Inspector. I want music, not scandal." "Truth," Purbright murmured, "makes a better hymn, Miss Vyse, even when sung off-key." After nightfall, as the belfry bells rang a shambolic tuning, and the parlour lights burned into the wee hours, Flaxborough's eyes settled on 3 suspects: Pierce and his bookkeeping, Slipper and her keys, and Vyse and her ledgers. Mrs. Mayhew, now an outcast and silent, became less a culprit and more a scapegoat. But the question lingered. What was the true secret at St. Leonard's, and which hands still held the code to unlock it? There was no rest for reputations in Flaxborough, as Saturday dimmed into Sunday. The town fixed its eyes on St. Leonard's memorial service with a mixture of anticipation and wariness. The committee's recent discord, Mrs. Mayhew's abrupt fall, and the fresh scent of unresolved scandal coiled beneath each pleasantry, quivering just out of reach. Even the weather seemed complicated, providing an overcast shroud through which the church's bells might toll, either for consolation or further confusion. Inside, the congregation arranged itself according to established systems, with committee members at the front for scrutiny, Councilman Pierce in clear view of the giving box, and Mrs. Slipper overseeing ushers like an admiral reviewing a crew. Miss Vyse, shoulders squared, presided at the organ bench, her hymn sheets glinting blue. Clough circulated with programmes and sharp opinions, and Ada Forbus flitted about, too earnest for treachery, yet always in someone's way. Inspector Purbright arrived quietly, observing the ranks' faces taut, as ribbons on the day after a failed parade. Sergeant Love kept to his side. Their entry was less noticed than imported rain. As the service progressed, talk drifted beneath the official murmur. The sermon delivered, the committee's presence lent unnecessary gravity to even the briefest prayers. The only true relief arrived in the form of the first hymn, which Miss V's played with a kind of tempestuous bravado, each chord striking through the congregation's composure. It was during the second hymnal piece, composed for longevity, if not exuberance, that an odd commotion began at the nave's rear. Ada, pale and urgent, scuttled to Mrs. Slipper, clutching a rolled document tied with blue ribbon. Whispered accusations tumbled out, found it under the vestry benchmarked for belfry audit. Mrs. Slipper snatched it, lips pinched, while Pierce scanned his agenda with accelerating unease. Purbright, alert, watched the change ripple through the committee's faces. The document, waved like a battle flag, became the centre of every glance. Miss V's faltered at the organ, her gaze darting to the scene. Her hymn slowed, the melody stretching until Mrs. Felbridge whispered, "It was during the second hymnal piece, composed for longevity, if not exuberance, that an odd commotion began at the nave's rear." Ada, pale and urgent, scuttled to Mrs. Slipper, clutching a rolled document tied with blue ribbon. Whispered accusations tumbled out, found it under the vestry, benchmarked for belfry audit. Mrs. Slipper snatched it, lips pinched, while Pierce scanned his agenda with accelerating unease. Purbright, alert, watched the change ripple through the committee's faces. The document, waved like a battle flag, became the centre of every glance. Miss V's faltered at the organ, her gaze darting to the scene. Her hymn slowed, the melody stretching until Mrs. Felbridge whispered, "It's sabotage! They want the appeal ruined!" Love jotted in his notebook, catching snippets as if netting fish. Code blue, Pierce's initial, Mrs. Slipper's roster. He leaned to Purbright, voice low. "Every time there's a disruption, it's a blue ribbon at the centre." There was no chance for drama to subside, for with the final blessing, Mrs. Slipper rose before the exiting crowd, her voice pitched for public shaming. "I have here evidence mislaid, not disproving the integrity of council appeal funds. Anyone doubting our accounts is invited to review them as soon as this service concludes. Sabotage! They want the appeal ruined." Love jotted in his notebook, catching snippets as if netting fish. Code blue, Pierce's initial, Mrs. Slipper's roster. He leaned to Purbright, voice low. "Every time there's a disruption, it's a blue ribbon at the centre." There was no chance for drama to subside, for with the final blessing, Mrs. Slipper rose before the exiting crowd, her voice pitched for public shaming. "I have here evidence mislaid, not disproving the integrity of council appeal funds. Anyone doubting our accounts is invited to review them as soon as this service concludes." Pierce, flustered, interjected, "Some accounts have always required clarification, Mrs. Slipper. The public is entitled to confidence." Miss V's, now off the organ, glided over, eyes sunken but defiant. "If the records are available, why have they not matched the receipts for 3 appeals? Why do several entries bear variations in blue and black ink?" Mrs. Felbridge, ever tenacious, piped in. "The real question is why my Phlox still hasn't been returned, and why prize entries are now stamped with Pierce's initials." The congregation, sensing mounting drama, barely moved. They took their cues from Purbright, whose polite detachment served as a kind of communal anchor. Purbright addressed Mrs. Slipper. "You have restored a document, but does it restore faith if questions outnumber lines?" His words, even but pointed, fell into a silence you could have counted on rosary beads. Mrs. Slipper, nonplussed, but unwilling to cede ground, responded, "Faith in records, Inspector, can only be lost by those who seek to mislead. Mayhew's methods were confused, and ours are transparent. Miss V's, if you require further assurance, the committee will present all blue-coded entries at the next audition omissions." Miss V's drew herself up, her composure brittle. "Without Mayhew's records, you have only half the story. If you wish to order, allow a full review by impartial eyes. I nominate Inspector Purbright." A ripple of approval followed, with dissenting undertones. Pierce hesitated, his bravado faltering in the face of public consensus. Clough, ever the opportunist, offered to host post-service coffee and keep the records dry. As the crowd filtered from the pews into the parish hall, committee members trailed Purbright, eager or desperate to control the conversation. Each offered tidbits. Pierce whispered about missing vouchers vanishing before sunrise. Mrs. Slipper insisted she'd kept the only true key, and Miss Vyse repeated that the Belfry appeal was sabotaged by bad arithmetic, not bad intent. Love followed, collecting statements. Ada had delivered the blue ribbons for Miss Vyse's hymnals, but Mrs. Slipper borrowed a roll for the audit. Clough recalled Pierce leaving early after the flower show, pocket full of blue crumbs like a council cheesecake. Mrs. Felbridge remembered seeing Mrs. Mayhew with a sheaf of notes, shaking as if she'd been caught in a rainstorm. The parish hall, more arena than sanctuary, now hosted animated debate. Purbright observed and asked, never accused, "Have any committee members noticed unauthorized access to the keys? Have you ever known funds to be recorded in both ledgers on the same day?" Pierce blustered. "Safeguards are paramount, Inspector." But with multiple hands, mistakes creep in. Slipper keeps her keys on a chain except when Clough borrows them for the tombola stand. Mrs. the Slipper deflected briskly. "I account for every anomaly, Inspector. Mayhew fell behind and her notes were always messy. Blue is for council use. Black is for parish alone." Miss Vyse was quick. "Then why has the black ink never matched the actual disbursements? Why do only the blue entries bear signatures?" Throughout, Purbright's attention hovered over behavioural cues. Pierce's eager explanations, Mrs. Slipper's defensive postures, and Vyse's insistent but restrained manner each revealed something more than numbers ever could. Even Ada's anxieties suggested that more notes were still waiting in unexamined corners. As the meeting drew to a strained close, Pierce attempted to regain authority. "With Inspector Purbright's review, we put all doubts to rest." Purbright did not contradict, but he did not confirm. He lingered beyond the crowd, noticing as the blue ribbon from the newly discovered document snagged on the leg of a pew, leaving a small silvery thread behind another quiet clue, easily missed. Outside, the town's weather relented, and a thin shaft of sunlight touched the steeple, but beneath that light, Flaxborough's roots remain tangled. Allegiances, secrets, and rivalries are interlaced through the church and committee. The truth sat somewhere beneath prizes, wax, receipts, and ribbon, waiting for the right hands or the right question to bring it to the surface. By midday, the events of the memorial service remained vivid enough to haunt Flaxborough's conversations, lending purpose to the gentle stampede between church, shops, and home. Coffee cups clinked more fiercely in kitchen windows, and curtains were drawn and twitched more often. Even the crows on St. Leonard's steeple seemed to confer in fussy knots as though keeping a ledger on human error. Yet below this surface vigilance, a deeper sense of anticipation ran through the town. The untangling of ledgers, blue codes, missing keys, and swapped flowers had become more than a mystery. Now it was a communal sport. Sergeant Love came upon Ada Forbes in the churchyard, the younger girl distractedly arranging fallen petals in uncertain spirals beside a mossy grave. Her mother, Mrs. Forbes of the council office, looked on with an air of fatigue. "If you please, Ada," Love began, not unkindly, "I've a bit more to ask. Who else have you fetched ribbons for or returned badges to this past week?" Ada shrugged, brow furrowing as she thought. "Only what Miss Vyse asked. Blue ribbons for the hymnals, a plaque for Clough's meat stall, and oh, Mrs. Slipper sent me to the vestry twice. both times when it rained. She said not to dawdle, and Mr. Pierce gave me an envelope and said to take it to the choir loft after the last practice. I only ever went where I was told. Love jotted the notes, thanked her kindly, and exchanged a glance with Mrs. Forbes, whose worry had begun to etch permanent lines at her mouth. She works hard, but she's young, Sergeant. If something's wrong, don't let her catch the blame. Love managed to smile, but inwardly he noted Ada's involvement was not so much malicious as manipulable, her hands and feet at the disposal of those above her in Flaxborough's quiet hierarchy. Meanwhile, Inspector Purbright kept an unobtrusive watch on St. Leonard's, conducting his inquiries with the methodical patience of a gardener, light on words but heavy on observation. The silvered key, a literal wildcard, remained in his jacket. By afternoon he had quietly visited both Blossom and Vine, where William accounted again for his movements, straight from the tent to Mr. Pierce. Honest, sir, never stayed to see the outcome. And the Crow and Trumpet pub, where midday trade included theories as fast as pies left cooling. Mrs. Felbridge, still furious over her flocks, had started a petition for authenticity in horticulture and accounting, her campaign now pinned next to the Belfry appeal at the Market Cross. Gossip, now practised and nimble, plucked the same. Meanwhile, Inspector Purbright kept an unobtrusive watch on St. Leonard's, conducting his inquiries with the methodical patience of a gardener, light on words but heavy on observation. The silvered key, a literal wildcard, remained in his jacket. By afternoon he had quietly visited both Blossom and Vine, where William accounted again for his movements, straight from the tent to Mr. Pierce, honest, sir, never stayed to see the outcome. And the Crow and Trumpet pub, where midday trade included theories as fast as pies left cooling. Mrs. Felbridge, still furious over her flocks, had started a petition for authenticity in horticulture and accounting, her campaign now pinned next to the Belfry appeal at the Market Cross. Gossip, now practised and nimble, plucked the same names: Mrs. Slipper, always watchful with keys and codes; Pierce, whose accounts and explanations doubled like dandelions; and Miss Vyse, whose dignity amplified with every discordant hymn. Yet with Mayhew gone, some townsfolk grumbled that things had become less predictable, not more so. She always did the notices on time, Clough observed at the tea-stand. Never mind she added a 0 by accident now and then. The current lot has not finished anything since the appeal lost its shine. That day another quiet substitution was unfolding at the church. Mrs. Slipper, enjoying her new authority, had instructed Ada and another volunteer, Mrs. Preston, to reorganize the vestry records. "No need for Inspector Purbright to poke here," she said, voice clipped. "Just set the ledgers in order by blue code and mind the old key box." She stepped into the nave, head high, but not before instructing Mrs. Preston to lock up at the end. Mrs. Slipper, always watchful with keys and codes; Pierce, whose accounts and explanations doubled like dandelions; and Miss Vyse, whose dignity amplified with every discordant hymn. Yet with Mayhew gone, some townsfolk grumbled that things had become less predictable, not more so. She always did the notices on time, Clough observed at the tea-stand. Never mind she added a 0 by accident now and then. The current lot has not finished anything since the appeal lost its shine. That day another quiet substitution was unfolding at the church. Mrs. Slipper, enjoying her new authority, had instructed Ada and another volunteer, Mrs. Preston, to reorganize the vestry records. "No need for Inspector Purbright to poke here," she said, voice clipped. "Just set the ledgers in order by blue code and mind the old key box." She stepped into the nave, head high, but not before instructing Mrs. Preston to lock up at the end. Half an hour later, Miss Vyse arrived looking for her misplaced hymnal notes. She found Ada and Mrs. Preston fussed with the crowded files and a bundle of blue-coded receipts tied with a ribbon. "Best bring all of those to Inspector Purbright," Miss Vyse advised. "No sense getting blamed if something's missing again." Meanwhile, Sergeant Love scrutinized the flow of coming and going. He caught Mrs. Slipper between meetings, noting not just her brisk deflections, but also a slip in her composure as he mentioned receipts delivered to Inspector Purbright. "Oh," she said too quickly. "Well, as long as they're in respected hands. More confusion, that's all we need." But her step, as she walked away, had the weight of someone doubting her own arrangement. Pierce, for his part, maintained a show of efficiency, though his forays into the parish office became hurried. Twice he returned from the vestry red-faced, and when Love inquired lightly as to the necessity of his visits, Pierce grumbled, "Just seeing that nothing goes amiss, too many loose ends." He seemed troubled by talk of a second ledger, his explanations, once fluent, now stuck in his throat. By late afternoon, Purbright assembled the day's findings on the vicar's desk. Ada delivered the bundled receipts, hurried, as if compliance itself might ward off trouble. Mrs. Preston waited nervously, eager to leave once her duty was acknowledged. Love reported quietly, "The duplicate keys never turned up, but I heard Mrs. Slipper instructing Ada on cleaning where no one should have been. Pierce claims he's found the final reconciliations, but won't share them just yet. And Miss Vizeschi found a hymn board numbered with blue wax, which wasn't there at practice yesterday." Purbright listened in silence, setting each small confirmation beside its fellow threads. The blue code became a habit, perhaps even an accident, he mused softly. But the habit had a sponsor, and the habit benefited someone, maybe more than one. Evening approached, the sun elusive, and St. Leonard's stood as a sombre backdrop to the lingering drama. As the vestry records were reviewed, ledgers, receipts, stray notes, all blue-coded, Purbright called Pierce, Slipper, and Vyse together. "There's a rhythm to what's been hidden," he said. "Patterns of errors, keys no one looked for, ribbons delivered by proxy. Receipts reappear and disappear as convenient as flowers at a show. When it suited, there was always confusion. Not just error/opportunity. He watched their faces registering defensive flickers. Pierce, voice tight, answered, "If you suggest misappropriation, Miss Vyse cut across him. If you mean collusion, Inspector, name the parties, but grant the truth. Nobody acted alone, even if they meant to." Mrs. Slipper pursed her lips, eyes darting. "Routine makes enemies of us all. If things were omitted, they'll be reconciled in time. There were always too many hands." He thanked them, letting the silence accumulate. "Tomorrow, Purbright. Promised, we'll review all the originals, not copies, not blue-waxed doppelgangers, committee and public alike. You'll find the facts plain as the parish clock if someone hasn't wound it back again." Outside, the last light flickered. Within the church, rows of scrupulously refiled receipts and ledgers stood like silent witnesses waiting for the morning and the inquiry to come. And in the narrow gap between order and exposure, Flaxborough held its breath not to see who had erred, but who had calculated the cost of confusion best. Monday arrived in Flaxborough, as predictably as porridge in the church hall, though never with quite the same cheer. The morning unfurled with an expectant hush, as if every garden gate were listening for the first honest word about church ledgers and council codes. Gossip, though less feverish, had grown razor-edged, just shy of naming villains outright. Over breakfast, Mrs. Felbridge passed the local paper across her table, headlines spelling out "Appeal Audit Promises Clarity," underlined with community suspicion as thick as marmalade. Inspector Purbright entered St. Leonard's with deliberate ease, his manner unchanging. Despite the gathering of townsfolk committee members, in rigid clusters, Ada and Mrs. Preston at the periphery, and even Mr. Clough, badge-pinned, lingering with a tray of day-old buns for bribery or consolation. Sergeant Love patrolled the aisle, noting who counted heads and who merely counted minutes. The inquiry was set for the nave, public as a market, with the ledgers, receipts, and all blue-coded evidence spread across tables. Miss V's had organised hymn boards for seating, with parcels of paperwork resting on navy cloth. Mrs. Slipper, wary now, stood behind her clipboard fortress, and Pierce, smile fixed, welcomed each arrival with a transparency that bordered on the theatrical. With the parish clerk cataloguing each document, Purbright began simply, "This is not a trial, nor an accounting of virtue. We seek only the missing numbers, the paths of receipts, and the truth of whose hand arranged confusion." As records were reviewed, Pierce attempted the familiar council dance explanations, intricate words spinning around the core issue. Receipts for the Belfry appeal had to be expedited, Inspector. The blue gladioli code was meant as a fast track, but certain funds were delayed pending additional donations. Mrs. Slipper was to safeguard the confirmations, and Miss V's to tally those received. He paused, assessing reaction. Mrs. Slipper interjected, higher ground claimed. "My procedures are flawless, save for what's interfered with by others. The missing receipts? They were misfiled after the flower show. Ada may have put one packet aside innocently, I trust." Ada, quiet as a shadow, shifted in her seat and whispered to Mrs. Preston, whose nerves produced a symphony of crumpled tissues. Miss Vyse, protective of clarity, read aloud from reconciliation forms. On 3 separate dates, blue-coded, entries for flower show funds overlapped with council budget allocations. No corresponding donation was ever credited. She rested a finger atop a sheet. "Here," Pierce authorised withdrawal prior to appeal, but the appeal's earnings weren't recorded until Mrs. Mayhew handled them, and by then totals dived. Clough muttered, mouth half full, "They should let calculators run the committees." Purbright surveyed reactions, his glance touching silver thread remnants on chair legs, candle wax stains spotted near council folders, and the shadow of a clipped price tag barely visible beneath Mrs. Slipper's ledger pile. Each artifact insisted the confusion had sponsors, not victims. "Love, careful," asked Pierce. "You say funds were fast-tracked. Who received them, exactly?" Pierce rehearsed, replied, "Banking transfer for repairs, cash for local suppliers, the Vicar's Memorial Trust, and occasional expenses for committee incidentals. Safekeeping demanded flexible allocation." Purbright pressed, calm yet inevitable, flexible to the point of invisibility. "Which transaction caused the missing receipts?" Before Pierce could respond, Mrs. Slipper blurted, "The audit was never complete. Certain flower entries did not match the voucher codes / funds came in, but not to those listed. I found one blue-coded packet in Ada's delivery bag. She said Mrs. Mayhew asked her to hold it." Ada nodded, cheeks flushed. Mrs. Mayhew said not all entries were to be shared. Some needed signing off by Mr. Pierce first. Now the entire room leaned closer. Miss V's fixed Pierce with a look stronger than a sermon. Why would a secretary hide donations from a treasurer? Why would a treasurer strand appeal funds in council limbo? Pierce, caught at last between facts and their inventors, searched for words that would not come. Mrs. Slipper, emboldened by the tide, asserted, "Mistakes multiply where oversight is loose." I corrected what was in my power. Inspector Purbright raised the price tag, the thread, and a blue-stained envelope. "What is the significance, do you suppose, of recurring blue?" "Thread, ribbon, wax, ink, even price tags." "Is it coincidence or code?" Silence settled. Love stepped forward, gentle but direct. "Did anyone here instruct Ada to move packets, tie ribbons, or fetch envelopes beyond usual duties? Mrs. Slipper hesitated. Only as committee practice. Ada knows the routine. Pierce, cornered, conceded. Sometimes I directed her for expediency, never for concealment. Purbright offered his signature detachment. Routine makes for easy forgetting, but habits, left unchecked, become substitutes for truth. A sudden commotion at the rear. Mrs. Preston, trembling, produced an envelope from her handbag. I was meant to deliver this to Miss V's. I forgot. I'm sorry. Found it wedged behind the record books last week. She placed it on the table. On its seal, blue wax and 2 initials intertwined, P and S. Miss V's opened it, reading receipts that aligned with the missing entries. Pierce, paper pale now, sat silent. Mrs. Slipper watched, inscrutable. Clough, satisfied, took 2 buns in celebration. Gossip outside triangulated the moment, so it was always ribbons and wax, never notes or numbers. The inspectors piecing together a code no one else wrote. I bet it's the Keys next who had more than Mayhew ever did. You see how quiet Mrs. Slipper becomes. She knows what blue wins. Purbright closed the meeting with one observation, measured and revealing nothing. A ledger's lament is not its missing lines, but the silence that follows confusion. Tomorrow we'll examine the Keys, their hands and their motives. As the meeting emptied, the truth seemed just out of reach, the pattern clear, the villain yet unnamed. Only the echoes of blue wax and quiet substitutions remained, waiting for the final clue to tip the balance. If the previous day's inquiry had left Flaxborough breathless, Tuesday brought about a collective exhalation. Markets reopened, gossip refreshed like cream on new buns, and at St. Leonard's the committee, less bold, assembled for the scheduled review of Keys and final reconciliations. This time, every eye watched Inspector Purbright for even the faintest flicker of accusation, but his serene and bland demeanour yielded nothing. Sergeant Love prepared the tables, laying out rows of keys labelled and mismatched, the ledgers, stray silver threads, blue-coded receipts, wax-stained envelopes, and clipped price tags. Miss V's supplied a pad of clean music staff paper, perhaps to impose order. Pierce wore an expression of forced ease, though his gaze lingered on the lockbox and the council memo, as if hoping they'd evaporate. Mrs. Slipper settled in with a set of keys clinking at her waist, the sound innocuous but somehow accusatory, in silence. Before proceedings began, Purbright requested the attendance of Ada, Mrs. Preston, and Clough, having played their part in the handling, fetching, or misdelivery of receipts and keys. The audience was a mix. Some parishioners were curious, others were invested, and most were determined to see a culprit emerge who wasn't one of them. Purbright's method this time was uncharacteristically visible. He invited each principal, Pierce, Slipper, and Vizetto, to describe the process for securing receipts and the transfer of keys. Pierce recited protocol, but his voice faltered on specifics. The appeal keys were intended for committee heads, but sometimes, due to scheduling and oversight, Mrs. Slipper retained extras. Mrs. Slipper corrected with matter-of-fact precision. I always returned spare keys after collection, except when instructed by Pierce to keep them for safety. Miss V's observed quietly. Some keys were not accounted for after Mrs. Mayhew's suspension. Receipts continued moving, and the blue code persisted regardless. She slid a ledger forward, date entries in blue, initials S, P, and a looping V inconsistent. At this, Purbright straightened a price, tag on the table, inspecting its edge with a deliberate pause. Curious, he said evenly, that a tag clipped in this fashion can be used to secure ribbon around an envelope. More curious still is that only certain keys seem to fit both lockboxes, the belfry chest, and the committee file drawer. His tone is unfailingly polite, just above a murmur. Everyone listened. Sergeant Love handed out each committee key, inviting all to try the lock to the belfry chest. Pierce's key stuck. Mrs. Slipper slipped in but could not turn. Miss V's attempted her own, only to discover hers was a duplicate. Ada, prompted, entered with the silver key discovered days before, and it spun perfectly. That was given to me by Miss V's to help with service programs. She said it made keeping record books easier. Mrs. Preston nodded. I saw her hand it over myself. I never thought anything about it. A ripple of discomfort ran through committee ranks. Miss V's, face suddenly pale, declared it was the original belfry key. I'd kept it since the last audit. Mrs. Mayhew gave it to me for safekeeping. Purbright regarded her not with suspicion, but with careful curiosity. Was it meant for disorder or for protection, Miss V's? She shook her head. For protection, I swear. I worried funds would never reach their proper tally otherwise. All records were meant for audit, but Mrs. Slipper and Pierce disagreed over receipts. They wanted control. Pierce, defensive, interjected, "We held back disbursements only when numbers failed to reconcile. It wasn't malice, just a procedure." Mrs. Slipper, hands rigid, said, "The duplicate keys were created after the rehearsal chaos. Pierce authorized it." We feared another mix-up. Purbright nodded, handing the silvered key back to Ada. "Let's review a simple fact. Disorder here was never simply error or neglect. It was a proliferation of keys, codes, and confusion. Each step made tracing accountability harder, and every new layer diminished individual responsibility. The blue wax on price tags, ribbons used to misdirect, and even envelopes were a way to mask a lack of clarity." He turned a clipped tag that matched the first one found at the rehearsal and fixed his gaze on Pierce. At what point did the confusion serve procedure, and when did it begin to hide something else? Pierce's only answer was a tight jaw and the silent admission in his expression. Outside, townsfolk pressed closer, speculation growing. Inspectors found the fault in the keyring, not in any ledger. The silver thread goes round all three who tied it tightest. I knew the committee liked blue, but not as camouflage. Clough, ever opportunistic, distributed buns to calm nerves while listening for anything to pin on a winner or loser. Ada, hands clutching the silver key, looked at Purbright uncertainly. Purbright staged one final test. He requested each committee member recount the events surrounding the first rehearsal chaos, the swapped casket, the blue gladioli, and the curtain too soon. Mrs. Slipper described her role as corrective, Pierce blamed scheduling, and Miss Vise claimed artistic necessity. Tellingly, Pierce confessed he had advised the staff to move items quickly, as the council's review was imminent. Why were the keys ever removed from regular storage? Purbright asked. This time the silence lengthened. Mrs. Slipper answered, "I followed Pierce's instruction. It was easier for auditing to keep everything together." Miss V's added, "But not for accuracy." I protested. I never wanted anything missed. Purbright concluded, key multiplications, missing receipts, and altered ribbons, none explained by error alone. The hand that encouraged substitution benefited most and blurred lines between oversight and convenience. Love, flipping his notebook shut, offered a quiet aside. "Tested every lock, sir. Only the originals match the records, not the copies." Pierce's composure cracked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I thought it was necessary, Inspector, to keep things moving." Purbright remained inscrutably kind. "Sometimes, Mr. Pierce, movement creates its own chaos, and every extra key, every fresh code, only confuses what should be plain." The meeting ended, subdued. The final clues, braided string tying keys, receipts, and ribbons, now sat in plain view. The town sensed reckoning at last, each resident aware the truth, like a hymn before the benediction, was on the verge of being sung. Morning in Flaxborough dawned with the peculiar quiet of resolved drama. A thin mist lingered over the market square, coating the benches and parish gates with softness, as though the town itself sought to smooth over recent discord. St. Leonard's bell rang truless ceremonially, more a reclamation echoing through small kitchens and shop fronts, where the final reckoning was the only topic worth discussing over tea. Inspector Purbright stood in the vestry, his posture unhurried, as he laid out the final items: the real and duplicate keys, silver threads, blue wax, clipped price tags, and ledgers now matched, line for line, to their receipts. Sergeant Love, notebook closed but mind open, lingered by his side. The committee arranged themselves as for confession rather than defence. Pierce, pale and resigned, Mrs. Slipper, upright, her keys silent, Miss V's, hands folded, gaze frank, and Ada nearby, uncertain but eager for release. Purbright delivered not a speech but an explanation, his voice measured, his logic as subtle as the weather. The confusion began innocently with blue code for special accounts and keys shared to expedite audits. In each case, necessity eroded routine. Pierce authorized extra keys, Mrs. Slipper safeguarded more than required, and Miss Vise kept originals against the risk of another mix-up. Ada became, inadvertently, the courier of everyone's errors. He moved gently from object to implication. The wax, ribbon, and tags obscured the origins of receipts, mirroring the extra keys that hid. Real control. The practice of substituting and multiplying, driven more by fear of scrutiny than malice, opened the door to mistakes and made the missing funds plausible enough to believe in a villain. Pierce's voice shook softly, the strain yielding honesty. I only meant to keep the audit swift. The appeal money never left, it just sat in limbo. Every blue-coded receipt matches a ledger entry, just spread among 3 hands. I didn't want the belfry to fail again, so I shuffled things, hoping no one would notice the shortfall until donations grew. Mrs. Slipper, defensive to the end, added, Our system might have worked if we'd kept stricter oversight. When the rehearsal turned to chaos, the casket was swapped, flowers missing, I doubled security and control, convinced that only centralization could rescue order. Miss V's lowered her head. In trying to protect the music, I held on to the original key. If I'd handed it over sooner, confusion might have cleared months ago. Purbright paused, surveying them as if each was a page in a puzzle's solution. Mrs. Mayhew, swept aside, became the scapegoat for everyone's panic. Her mistakes were real slips of distraction, amplified by the system's design. But the true error was collective, not personal. The urge to substitute when clarity faltered, and the habit of adding keys and codes until no one could say who held responsibility. Ada's small voice piped up, I only meant to help. Everyone wanted things to run smoothly, but sometimes they argued so much I didn't know who to listen to. Love offered a gentle nod. Chaos has a way of making helpers out of the innocent. But the record is clear now, Ada. What remains is understanding. The room accepted this, not with relief, but with a sheepish recognition. As Purbright tallied the reconciled ledgers, he spoke quietly. All funds accounted for. Oversight, not theft. Substitution, covered error, not malice. The blue-coded confusion keys, ribbons, were nothing more than a collective panic-turned system, stripping away accountability. He returned the original belfry key to Miss V's, the spare set to Mrs. Slipper, and the committee's receipts to Pierce, now ready for a full and public audit at last. The town returned over the coming days to its ancient rhythm. Mrs. Mayhew, quietly restored as secretary, kept her distance, but received more than one redemptive smile from careful townsfolk. Pierce worked harder on transparency, Mrs. Slipper reduced her use of keys, and Miss Vyse led the choir with renewed confidence. Clough, ever practical, made the next market day's buns blue, for luck and memory, he claimed. Gossip, once rampant, found new targets in mundane mishaps. The town agreed, with characteristic certainty, that such confusion could never happen again. For now, Flaxborough had weathered scandal through understated honesty and collective humbling. Its secrets were revealed not as sinister, but as the natural result of imperfect people, pressed by custom, fear, and the need to save face. Inspector Purbright never commented on the outcome, only observed, polite as always, and left the closing of the episode to the town itself. Love, earnest and loyal, watched for the next minor disaster from behind the counter at Drapery, a little wiser about ribbons, wax, and the double-edged promise of keys.